Gentlemen, let's have a real conversation. Do you honestly believe that the reason she isn't texting back, or the reason you're stuck in the friend zone, is because you aren't being nice enough? If you do, stop right there. That is a lie, a social script designed to keep you subservient. Here's the darkest truth. Women don't resist the men who treat them well. They resist the men who treat them as a utility. There is a psychological force far more potent than being a good guy. It's a set of Machiavellian laws that most men are terrified to use. But once you unlock them, she doesn't just notice you. She becomes consumed by you. No chasing, no begging, no flowers. Just 12 minutes of psychological recalibration. Stay with me because I'm going to give you the exact law of scarcity that makes her lean in and compete for your time, while other guys are still playing the role of the reliable friend who finishes last. My name is Julian, and I've spent years decoding the gap between what people say they want and what their biology demands. Let's crush the biggest myth of all, that agreeableness equals attractiveness. It doesn't. It equals invisibility. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal the savage law, a 3-word psychological principle that flips the script from you chasing her to her competing for you. This isn't about being toxic, it's about being sovereign. But before we dive into the Machiavellian mechanics, do me a favor. If you're ready to stop being a pawn in the dating game and start being the player who rewrites the rules, hit that like button and subscribe. Every week, I break down the dark psychological insights on attraction and dominance that society is too afraid to tell you. Drop a comment below with the word sovereign if you're ready to reclaim your edge. In 1477, a man named William Hastings stood in the presence of King Richard III, confident in his utility. For decades, Hastings had been indispensable, the reliable strategist, the loyal advisor, the man the king could always turn to. He had made himself so useful that he believed himself untouchable. Within hours, he was dead, executed on charges that barely mattered because the real crime was simple. He had become predictable, and in becoming predictable, he had become expendable. The courtiers who survived the Renaissance didn't do so by being loyal. They survived by being necessary in ways that kept them mysterious. They controlled information. They withheld their full allegiance. They made themselves rare. Hastings died because he had become the opposite. Transparent, available, forever at the king's disposal. He was the nice guy of the 15th century, and the 15th century had no mercy for nice guys. 5 centuries later, the mechanism hasn't changed. It's just quieter. Today, we call it social death. You know the feeling. You're the friend everyone texts when they need something. You're the shoulder to cry on at 2 a.m. You're the guy who shows up, who listens, who never says no. You've made yourself so useful that you've become invisible. Women don't reject you. They simply stop seeing you as a man. You become a utility, a Swiss Army knife, a tool that gets left in the drawer. The courtiers understood something modern men have forgotten. Being helpful is not the same as being powerful. Hastings was helpful. He was also dead within the year. The psychological mechanism is the same whether we're talking about Tudor courts or dating apps. When you make yourself too available, you signal that your time has no value. When you telegraph your needs, you become predictable. And prediction breeds contempt. The king didn't execute Hastings because Hastings failed him. He executed him because Hastings had become so useful that removing him cost nothing. There was no mystery, no unpredictability, no power. Women respond to the same calculus. The man who is always there, always agreeable, always transparent about his intentions. He isn't rejected because he's too nice. He's rejected because he's ceased to be a puzzle. He's become a script she's read 1,000 times. This is what separates the men who finish last from the men who finish first. Not decency, but scarcity. Not kindness, but sovereignty. The courtiers who lived learned to make themselves rare, not by being cruel, but by being unavailable for prediction, by refusing to be a utility. This is where our story begins. Julian had the kind of face people trusted immediately. Not handsome in a way that threatened, but approachable, warm, the face of someone who would remember your coffee order and ask about your mother. For 3 years, he had perfected the role of the reliable friend. He showed up. He listened. He never complained. He was the man women called when they needed to talk about the men who didn't care enough to listen. Sarah was the reason he had mastered this script. She was brilliant, beautiful, and completely unaware that Julian had reorganized his entire life around her orbit. He had made himself available in small ways that accumulated into something massive. A ride to the airport at dawn, hours of emotional labor disguised as friendship. The kind of presence that becomes so normalized, so expected, that it stops registering as a choice and starts feeling like an obligation. Not for him, but for her. He was useful. Perfectly, predictably useful. The first time he told her how he felt, she cried. Not tears of joy, but something closer to panic. "You're like a brother to me," she said, and he watched the words land like they were obvious, like he should have always known. He hadn't told her again, but he also hadn't stopped being there. He couldn't. He had built an entire identity around being the one she could count on, and dismantling it felt like losing himself. What Julian didn't understand was that he had already lost himself. The reliable friend badge, the one he wore with quiet pride, had become a weight. Not because reliability is weakness, but because his reliability was a cage. He had made himself so available that he had become predictable, and predictability is the death of attraction. It's the slow suffocation of mystery. He watched from the sidelines as Sarah dated men who barely returned her calls, men who treated her indifference with indifference of their own. These men had something Julian didn't. They had refused to make themselves a utility. They had boundaries that she found magnetic, because boundaries signal that your time means something. Julian's mistake wasn't that he cared too much. It was that he had confused caring with surrender. He had collapsed his own life into her gravitational field and mistaken that collapse for love. What he had actually done was erase himself so thoroughly that there was nothing left for her to be attracted to, only a helpful ghost haunting the periphery of her life. The reliable friend doesn't finish last because he's too nice. He finishes last because he has already removed himself from the game. Julian had always believed that honesty was the foundation of connection. If Sarah knew how he felt, if she understood the depth of his devotion, surely she would see the truth of his character. So he laid himself bare. He told her about the nights he couldn't sleep thinking about her. He explained in careful detail how her happiness had become inseparable from his own. He made himself transparent. What he discovered was that transparency is not intimacy, it's exposure. The moment you reveal your entire hand. You surrender all negotiating power. You become readable, predictable. A book that can be opened and closed at will, with no surprises on the next page. Sarah didn't feel moved by his honesty. She felt burdened by it. His emotions became her responsibility, a weight she hadn't asked to carry. His transparency had transformed his feelings from something attractive, a mysterious depth, into something exhausting, a demand. This is the transparency trap. Men believe that revealing vulnerability will create connection, but what it actually does is destroy polarity. Attraction requires a certain friction, a dynamic where both people aren't entirely known to each other. When you eliminate mystery, you eliminate desire. The men who captivated Sarah were never the ones who told her how they felt. They were the ones who remained slightly opaque, who didn't explain themselves, who left her guessing. She invested energy trying to figure them out because they hadn't already handed her the complete puzzle with all the pieces arranged. Julian had handed her everything. His hopes, his fears, his entire emotional infrastructure laid out like a map. She had memorized the terrain so completely that there was nothing left to explore. He had made himself fully known, and in doing so, he had become fully invisible. The irony is brutal. The transparency he thought would bring them closer had created an unbridgeable distance. She could see all of him now, and what she saw was a man without boundaries, without mystery, without the kind of sovereignty that makes a woman lean in instead of pull away. He had confused openness with power, and in that confusion, he had surrendered the only thing that might have made him worth fighting for. Julian had developed a habit of checking his phone the way an addict checks for a fix, not because he expected messages. He knew what his inbox contained. Silence punctuated by occasional requests for favors. He checked because he was waiting for the moment when Sarah would finally acknowledge him the way he needed to be acknowledged. Every text he sent was calibrated to elicit a response, a small hit of validation that would confirm he still mattered. This was his second mistake, and it was more insidious than the first. Approval addiction is a slow poison because it operates beneath the surface of consciousness. Julian didn't think of himself as needy. He thought of himself as attentive. He remembered details about her life and brought them up in conversation, watching her face for signs of appreciation. He crafted messages designed to make her laugh, then waited anxiously for her to reciprocate his effort. Every interaction became a performance calibrated to win her favor. What he didn't understand was that this constant seeking of validation was deeply repulsive. Women don't consciously think this man is approval-seeking, and therefore I'm unattracted to him. The reaction is biological, instinctive. When a man needs her validation, she registers it as low status. His desperation to be seen, appreciated, and valued by her signals that he doesn't have these things elsewhere. He's not choosing her. He's dependent on her. And dependence, at a primal level, is unattractive. The men Sarah actually wanted were the ones who seemed indifferent to her opinion. They didn't perform for her approval. They didn't wait for her validation. They moved through the world as if her assessment of them was irrelevant. This indifference wasn't cruel. It was liberating. It signaled that they had a life, a purpose, a sense of worth that existed independently of her regard. Julian had surrendered his independence the moment he made her approval the metric by which he measured himself. He had handed her the power to determine his emotional state, and she could feel that power like a weight. The more desperately he sought her validation, the more she withdrew, not out of malice, but out of a biological recoil from a man who had made himself her satellite. He was orbiting her gravity when he should have been orbiting his own. The shift began small, almost imperceptible. Julian stopped texting Sarah first, not out of anger or calculation, but out of necessity. He had run out of things to say that didn't sound like a plea. In that silence, something unexpected happened. She reached out. It was a small thing, a casual message about a show she was watching. But Julian noticed the difference immediately. When he didn't initiate, when he didn't perform his devotion, she moved toward him. The dynamic had inverted. This was the first law: conceal your purpose. For years, Julian's purpose had been transparent: to be useful to Sarah, to earn her affection through reliability and emotional labor. His every action broadcast the same message: I exist to serve your needs. Once he stopped broadcasting that message, something shifted in how she perceived him. He began to live differently, not for her benefit, but for his own. He started projects that had nothing to do with her. He made plans with other people and didn't mention them. He developed opinions that weren't designed to align with hers. These weren't manipulations. They were the natural byproducts of reclaiming his own life. But the effect was undeniable. Sarah began asking about his life in ways she never had before. She wanted to know what he was doing, who he was spending time with, what had made him seem different. The questions came from a place of genuine curiosity, maybe even concern. He had become interesting again because he was no longer completely knowable. The key was that Julian didn't announce his transformation. He didn't say, "I'm moving on," or "I've decided to focus on myself." He simply stopped confessing his feelings and started implying his value through his actions. He became a man with a life, with priorities, with boundaries. Not to manipulate Sarah, but because a man without these things isn't worth having. Concealing your purpose doesn't mean being deceptive. It means refusing to make your intentions everyone's business. It means living with enough agency that your worth isn't dependent on external validation. When you stop advertising your desperation, people stop treating you with the indifference that desperation deserves. You become something worth paying attention to, not because you're playing a game, but because you've finally stopped playing one. The man who needs her approval, you're the man who grants it. Next, 4 minutes of the ghosting exercise. But you're not actually ghosting her. You're visualizing social interactions with zero goal. Imagine conversations where you don't perform, don't try to impress, don't calculate her reaction. See yourself speaking to her the way you'd speak to a stranger at a bar, present but detached. No agenda, no outcome dependency. This breaks the spell of urgency that makes you needy. When you remove the goal of getting her, you stop broadcasting desperation. Finally, 5 minutes of the power inventory. This is where you reclaim your throne. Recall 3 specific moments when you were undeniably the prize. A time she waited for your text. A moment someone chose you. An instance where your presence mattered more than hers. Feel those moments in your chest. Let them rebuild your baseline. You're not fabricating confidence. You're remembering it. 12 minutes. 1 protocol. Everything changes. Julian had been the 2 a.m. guy for 3 years. The one she called when her world fell apart. The one who showed up, no questions asked, no resentment, just presence. It was his utility, his value proposition. He was the safe harbor, the reliable anchor, the man she could deploy whenever chaos needed containment. But utility is the slowest poison. It feels like love because it's consistent. It feels necessary because she reinforces it constantly. I don't know what I'd do without you. These words are not declarations of affection. They are admissions of addiction. And addicts don't fall in love with their dealers. They resent them the moment the high wears off. So Julian stopped. The first test came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Her text. I'm spiraling. I need to talk. His phone glowed in the darkness. The old Julian would have responded in 60 seconds, would have abandoned sleep, would have become her emotional sandbag. The new Julian read it, set the phone down, and went to sleep. She texted again at 3:44 a.m., then 6:22 a.m., then a call that went unanswered. By 9:30 a.m., the tone had shifted. Never mind, I figured it out. Translation: I realized I'm capable. Translation: I'm noticing your absence. This is the law of scarcity in action. You don't announce your withdrawal. You don't write paragraphs about needing space or setting boundaries. That's still seeking her reaction. You simply become scarce. Your time becomes finite. Your responsiveness becomes unpredictable. The utility she relied upon vanishes not with drama, but with indifference. She will panic. Not because she loves you, but because her coping mechanism has been removed. And in that panic, in that sudden awareness that you are no longer her on-demand resource, something shifts in her neurology. You stop being the comfortable utility. You become the mysterious variable, the one she can no longer predict or control. This is where the power reversal begins. It came on a Friday night. Not a desperate plea, not an emergency. Just a casual text. Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. You good? 3 words that revealed everything. The shift had already begun. She was reaching out not because she needed him, but because she needed to know if she still mattered to him. The dynamic had inverted. Now he was the variable. Now she was the one constructing narratives around his silence. Julian read it. Waited 4 hours before responding. Not out of games, out of principle. Calculated distance isn't about punishment. It's about recalibrating her expectations. He typed, "Yeah, been focused on some things. What's up?" Notice what he didn't do. He didn't apologize for the silence. Didn't explain where he'd been. Didn't perform availability. He acknowledged her without centering her. She was one item on a much longer list. Her response came in minutes. Nothing much. Just missed talking to you. The words seemed casual, but the urgency behind them screamed louder. Miss is past tense. She's already aware of his absence, already feeling the void where his utility used to be. This is the showdown. This is the moment most men fail because they confuse this opening with permission to return. They respond with enthusiasm, with apologies, with a desperate resurrection of the old dynamic. They hand back the leash. Julian did something different. He responded 3 hours later. "Cool. Let me know when you're free." He didn't suggest a time. Didn't propose solving her loneliness. He made her move next. Made her invest. Made her compete for access to him. She did. By the following Wednesday, she was the one suggesting coffee. By the next week, she was the one texting first. By the month's end, the architecture of their entire interaction had reversed. She was no longer the prize. She was the pursuer. The law of scarcity had done its work. Indifference had become magnetic, and Julian had finally become unforgettable. Julian felt it the moment the power shifted. The intoxication of control. The rush of watching her scramble for his attention. The seductive whisper that said, "You've finally won. You've finally cracked the code. Use it." This is where most men get lost. The dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, isn't a diagnosis. it's a temptation. Once you've tasted the antidote to neediness, the poison of weaponized indifference becomes intoxicating. You start playing games not because they work, but because they feel good. You manipulate not because you need to, but because you can. You gaslight her about your commitment levels. You manufacture jealousy by flirting with her friends. You withhold affection not as strategy, but as sport. And for a moment, it works. She orbits closer. She performs harder. She becomes increasingly desperate to crack your code. You've won the game. But here's the dark truth beneath the darkness. You've also become the very thing you despised. You've traded being her utility for being her predator. The dynamic has shifted, but the dysfunction remains. You're still operating from scarcity, still driven by her reaction, still dependent on her pursuit to feel powerful. Power without character isn't sovereignty, it's just a different prison. The Machiavellian laws work because they're true about human psychology, but truth without wisdom is a blade without a handle. You'll bleed just as much as your target. The man who pulls back his utility to create attraction is using psychology as architecture. The man who weaponizes her insecurity, who deliberately hurts her to feel superior, who maintains control through cruelty, that man is still enslaved. He's simply enslaved to his own ego. Real sovereignty isn't about making her chase you. It's about not needing her to chase you at all. It's about applying these laws not as weapons, but as boundaries. Not to manipulate, but to protect your own integrity. The protocol works, but only if you remain human while executing it. 6 months later, Julian didn't recognize the man he'd been. Not because he'd changed who he was, but because he'd finally stopped performing for an audience of one. The constant internal monologue, "Does she like me? Should I text? Will she respond?" had gone silent. Not suppressed. Silent. There was nothing left to suppress because the question itself had become irrelevant. She still texted, still wanted his time, still orbited his availability with the same gravitational pull he once felt toward hers. But something fundamental had shifted in him. He could see her clearly now, not as the prize he needed to win, but as a person he was evaluating. And evaluation changes everything. One evening she asked him directly, "Where is this going?" It was the question she'd been afraid to ask for months. The vulnerability behind it was real. And Julian, for the first time, actually considered the answer. Not for her sake, for his own. He looked at the architecture of their dynamic. The way she'd reorganized her schedule around his availability. The way she'd softened her demands, become more accommodating, more eager to please. He saw the reversal of power. And in that clarity, he realized something that shattered the entire narrative. None of it mattered, because the question had finally evolved. He wasn't asking, "How do I get her?" anymore. He was asking, "Is she actually worth my time?" And the honest answer was complicated. She was capable, attractive, increasingly devoted. But she wasn't the architect of her own life. She was reactive, shaped by whatever man was currently in her orbit. She'd traded her agency for his approval, exactly the way he'd once traded his for hers. The strategist doesn't win because he's heartless. He wins because he's honest. He sees the board clearly. He recognizes that true sovereignty isn't about making her chase you. It's about being the kind of man who doesn't need to ask if she's worth it. He already knows his own answer. You aren't changing who you are. You're unlocking the man biology intended you to be. You're moving from the suppliant to the strategist. Don't let another day pass being the nice guy who finishes last. Start the protocol tomorrow. Watch how the room shifts when you walk in. Watch how she shifts when she realizes she can no longer predict your next move. Stay strong. Stay Machiavellian. Stay sovereign.